What's up, everyone? Welcome back. Patrick here. Moving on to the next question. So a company had assets and debt of $770,000 and $350,000 respectively at the beginning of the year. Then during the year, it has net income of $90,000 and a payout ratio of 30%. If it grows at its sustainable growth rate, how much additional debt will it need to issue? Now, this particular question here, I'm actually going to show you two ways to go about it. It's kind of neat how both ways sort of come to the same result. Now, before doing that, let me just organize the information that we're given. So notice we're given information about the balance sheet at the beginning of the year. So we have the assets, then we have the debt or the liabilities, and then the equity. So we're told that the assets are $770,000. And then we're told the debt is $350,000. So notice that from those two pieces of information, we can find out what the equity is. It's just going to be the difference between these, so $420,000. That's what the beginning equity is going to be. And we actually need that beginning equity because we're dealing with the sustainable growth rate, right? And what is a sustainable growth rate? Return on equity times the retention ratio, or 1 minus the payout ratio. So that's the balance sheet here, and then we're told the net income is $90,000. So that's from the income statement. That's the only information about the income statement we're given. But that's enough. So this company is going to grow at the sustainable growth rate. So sustainable growth rate, as I just mentioned, it's return on equity times the retention ratio, or 1 minus the payout ratio, which is what we are given. So I'm going to use that for this bracket instead of the retention ratio. Return on equity, what is that? It's the net income, $90,000, over the beginning equity, $420,000. So it's going to be $90,000 over $420,000 times 1 minus the payout ratio, 0.3. So this would end up being 0.7, this bracket. And then when you multiply by the results of this bracket, you would end up with 0.15. So 15%. So that's the sustainable growth rate. So the company is going to grow at that rate. And what does that mean when they say a company grows at a certain rate? It means its assets are growing at that rate. So what we can do, let me write the sustainable growth rate over here. It's 15%. Well, what we can do now is we can make a balance sheet at the end of the year, knowing the sustainable growth rate is 15%. And to make this balance sheet, I'm going to go about it two ways. I'm going to show you two different ways to do it, as I said at the beginning of the video. So we'll have assets, debt, and then equity. So the assets, we know they're growing at 15%. So what we can do is we could take the beginning assets, $770,000, and then multiply by 1 plus that growth rate of 15%, or 0.15. You could also take 15% of $770,000 and then add it on to the 770. But this here is going to give you that asset amount directly. And when you do this calculation, this times 1.15, you would end up with $885,500, like that. Right, so this here is going to be the assets at the end of the year, right? These assets grew by 15%. Now, to find the right side of this ending balance sheet, here's where the two different ways come in. So to find this equity here, we know the equity amount is always going to be what? It's going to be the beginning equity plus the amount that is retained in the company. And so we know the beginning equity is $420,000, And we know that the payout ratio is 30%, and we know the net income. So notice that the net income of $90,000, 30% of that is being paid out, which means what? 70% is being retained. 30% of 90,000 is 27,000 if you multiply it by 0.3. 0.7 times 90,000 gives us 63,000. So this is the amount that's being retained, the addition to retained earnings. And so this equity amount, the ending equity of a period, is going to be the beginning equity amount plus this amount. So when we add these, we would end up with 483,000. That's the ending equity amount. And then to get this debt amount, we can just take the difference between these two. And when we find the difference, it's basically going to be $402,500. Like that. Okay, so that's one way to go about it. Another cool way to go about this, to have found these amounts, to find this amount, there's only one way. Just the way we did it, we grow these by 15%. But to find that right side of the balance sheet, if a company is growing at the sustainable growth rate, what does that imply? If you remember from the videos before, from the lecture videos when we went over sustainable growth rate in more detail, it means that the debt to equity ratio is constant. The debt to equity ratio is staying constant. And so we weren't given these, but we were given this. We had these amounts. So notice that the debt to equity ratio, if we were to find it using that beginning balance sheet, actually, let me just do the work over here. So if we had the debt to equity ratio of 350,000 over 420,000, using the balance sheet at the beginning, this here, notice the zeros would cancel out, so we'd have 35 over 42, and then we can divide both the numerator and denominator by 7, so we'd end up with 5 over 6. So that's the debt to equity ratio, and we know that that debt to equity ratio stays constant, so that would be the same ratio for the balance sheet at the end of the year. So we have these assets and we have this debt to equity ratio, and so we know how to find these amounts. So if we have a debt to equity ratio of 5 over 6, if we make a mini balance sheet, we'd have debt of 5, equity of 6, which means the assets would be 11. And so we would just use these proportions here and then that ending assets amount to find these respective amounts. So for example, if we were solving for the debt, let's pretend these numbers aren't here. Let's say we're solving for debt, which is actually all we need. We don't even need this equity amount for this question because they're asking how much additional debt are we issuing. So if we solve for the debt, if we didn't know this, we'd do x over the assets equals debt to assets equals 5 over 11. We'd use that ratio right there. And then you could cross multiply 11x equals 5 times 885,500, whatever that would be, divide both sides by 11, and you'd end up getting x equaling that 402,500. Right? And then you can get this equity amount by subtracting those two. You could also get the equity amount if we made the equity be the variable. We can do the equity over the assets equals 6 over 11. So then when we follow that same process, we would end up with 483,000. And then we could find that debt amount. Another way is, it's not another way, but a way to check whether these amounts are right, is we can find the debt to equity ratio between these two amounts. If we take this divided by that, this would simplify if we put it as a fraction to 5 over 6. Or if you got the decimal of that, then you take this and divide it by that. The decimals should be the same. Remember, debt to equity ratios can also be in decimal form. but this simplified nicely to 5 over 6, so that's what I use. This here would simplify to 5 over 6 as well, and that makes sense. It should, because again, the debt to equity ratio is staying constant if a company is growing at the sustainable growth rate, right? So multiple ways to get that right side of that ending balance sheet. And we're still not done yet, because what's the question asking? How much additional debt will need to be issued? Well, it would just be the difference between this and this, right? So the debt issue would be the ending debt of 402,500 minus the beginning debt, 350,000, and that would give us 52,500. So that's what the answer, the final answer would be to this question.